Welcome to this last seminar of the Director's Series on ethics and political violence for this academic year. I'm Scott Sagan, the co-director here at CSAC and professor of political science. And I'm really pleased that Sam Moyn, Henry Luce Professor of Jurisprudence at the Yale Law School and Professor of History, has come here today to talk about his recent book, Humane, How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War. Sam is also the author of numerous books, including The Last Utopia, Human Rights in History, and Not Enough Human Rights in an Unequal World. Following his talk, Alan Weiner, Senior Lecturer in Law and Director of the Program in International Comparative Law at Stanford Law School, will be giving a brief discussant note, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. I should also note that Alan is the co-teacher of an excellent Rules of War class, which includes Sam Moyn's recent New York Times op-ed piece as one of the assignments for the students to read. So it's great to have you come out to Stanford and join us here, and welcome to the seminar.
Thanks to Scott. He also wrote a fascinating review of this book, and I'm extremely grateful that he took his time on that. So I'm doubly indebted to Scott. I'll review what the main contentions of the book are for a half hour, and then look forward to hearing from Alan and engaging in general discussion. So these days, I'm starting this book presentation with Nuremberg, the International Military Tribunal that the Allies set up and staged in 1945-6. And what interests me about this amazing trial is its priorities. It started with aggression as the supreme crime that various Nazis were alleged to have committed. And there were some, I think, very good reasons for prioritizing crimes against peace as the worst thing that the Nazis had done, over and above the other charges, the secondary charge at Nuremberg of crimes of war, and the tertiary one of crimes against humanity. First, they thought of aggression as something like a gateway crime, on analogy with gateway drug. If you commit aggression, it's not unlikely that you're also going to commit war crimes and maybe even crimes against humanity. And so if you're a believer in maxims like the greater includes the lesser, then you might say banning, controlling, deterring the bigger evil that initiates war would include or incorporate a ban on the lesser evil, especially if you stop the war before it starts, or once it starts, before it gets too dirty and rowdy. But then there were a lot of other reasons why aggression came first in the minds of those who organized Nuremberg. Because think of all the things that are legal, even today, once a war starts, including an aggressive war. First, soldiers die. And currently they can die in any number and at any time, at least in the battle space. And of course, the people who set up Nuremberg had lived through 2 world wars in which tens of millions of husbands, sons, and brothers had died merely because they were in armies, legally died. Now, of course, a lot of civilians died too, but aggression also matters, controlling it, because even today, a lot of civilians can die legally. We know now that you can't shoot at or target a civilian. That's illegal, that's a war crime. But you're allowed to kill them in massive numbers collaterally. And at this time in history, almost without limit. Now there's a little bit of a limit, and I'll get to that later. But if you don't have a war or stop it once it starts, a lot of civilians who would die legally survive. And then consider the budget, the costs of war, the money misspent legally, although stupidly, for a bad cause. Last, maybe worst in our time, consider the unintended consequences of wars, even when initiated for supposedly good moral reasons, or even good ones, because there are things that can happen you don't expect. You might destabilize a whole region. So consider that in our time, our country's Middle Eastern wars in places like Iraq and Libya have probably led to more people dying, not because the United States and its allies targeted them or killed them collaterally, but because in the upheaval, they perished. And that's connected to aggression, even if it's, in a sense, legal, that the aftermath is so chaotic and fatal. And so for all of these reasons, it seems to me it was correct to care most about aggression at Nuremberg. But the thesis of my book is that for about 50 years, we stopped. We've stopped. We've cared, especially when it comes to US war, less about the conception and initiation of war, even when they're arguably illegal, and transferred our concern, our focus, much more to how our wars are fought. That's what we debate about our wars, whether the war is torturous or torture-free, whether too many civilians die under the drones, not whether it's happening, but rather whether it's too brutal. Now, I think there are a lot of interesting reasons this shift occurred, but I want to argue just descriptively that it did, and then get into a debate about what I see as the malign consequences of the shift. Now, it's not just me saying that we've taken our eye off of aggression in the international system. In his irate rant just before he went on to commit the crime of aggression himself, Vladimir Putin pointed out that a lot of Western wars have involved international illegality at the point of initiation, no matter how brutally or humanely they were then fought. He gives a kind of laundry list of them. First, the bombing of Belgrade in 1999 by NATO, in flagrant contradiction to the rules of force in the international system. I was actually an intern at the White House at this time. We believed that those rules were frustrating, that they kept us from doing the right thing, and so we did it. And yet, I think we reaped the whirlwind in doing so. We had a justification or excuse for breaking the law in starting an illegal war, and yet, in view of the consequences of that act, cited by Putin so many decades later, I think we can revisit whether the justification or excuse worked. Then he mentions Iraq, flagrantly illegal in initiation. Libya, a fascinating case I've already mentioned, which was authorized by the United Nations Security Council, but arguably went on to extend beyond the mandate of the resolution to evolve or devolve into regime change. Interestingly, Putin mentioned Syria, which many Americans have complained about as not involving an intervention, but which he claims involved US militarization. Now, our first response to this laundry list is what our mothers taught us: two wrongs don't make a right. none of this bad behavior, even if you think it happened, could possibly extenuate more of it, including by Putin's, especially if you think his aggression was even more flagrantly illegal. And yet, the fact would remain that if this laundry list is right, we have a problem of explanation. How did Americans who, with the Soviets at the time, prioritized in agreement with one another aggression as the worst crime, go on to commit so much of it, not only during the Cold War, but amazingly, since? And what happens now? So my book tries to argue that we should concern ourselves with the exclusionary focus we've had on what happens within war about the past 50 years, tries to get at what makes that period in history unique in its concern for cleaner war, especially under newfangled international rules governing the conduct of hostilities, and worries that, as noble as that focus is, it may have involved a negligence of the older priority to control force in the first instance. So to lay that argument out, I'll just, reflect a bit about, why I wrote the book and what the historical argument says. It was really when Barack Obama gave his Nobel Peace Prize address that I first began to wonder about the specificity of this new set of priorities. Many of us will remember those days in 2008 when he was a first-year president with nostalgia. Consider where the country is now and how our hope and optimism has transmuted given later events. And yet everyone was surprised, in spite of our idolatry of Obama, that he won the Nobel Peace Prize that fall in his first year. He was shocked when he came down from the White House residence. He had a new dog. His younger daughters were there, whom he said helped him keep it real, even though his global superstardom was now, at its absolute apex. And he actually said he didn't deserve the Nobel Peace Prize. He hadn't done anything yet. Now, as we'll see, that wasn't true. He'd begun reinventing the war on terror he inherited from his predecessor. But what I found amazing was what he said when he went to Oslo. He actually asked if he had to go, and they said he did if he wanted the prize. So he crafted an extraordinary address. We know a lot about it because of the memoirs of people like Samantha Power and Ben Rhodes. And the amazing thing I think about it is that he denied his usual ancestry. Martin Luther King Jr. had won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, but Obama said King hadn't had the burden of being at the head of the greatest armed superpower in world history, whereas Obama didn't have the luxury of pacifism. America in a fallen world would have to continue fighting wars. But then something striking happened. In compensation for this fact, maybe in some relation to the ideal of peace that the prize is supposed to honor, he said America would fight humanely. It wouldn't torture anymore. Guantanamo Bay, the site deemed unholy by the world, as a law-free zone. You want me to get that? What was to be closed hasn't happened yet. But above all, it was interesting that Obama name-checked the first Nobel Peace Prize winner in 1901, co-winner. That was Henri Dunant, who had founded the Red Cross, and his claim to fame had been that he devised the idea not of stopping war, but of making it more humane. He'd been the inspiration for the very first Geneva Convention, the successor treaties of which from 1949, Obama said America would embrace. Even if it had to fight war, its exceptionalism would consist in the humanization of its wars. And kind of an amazing thing in the history of great power, actually. And no president before, no great leader, to the best of my knowledge, had ever, um, cited Henri Dunant as inspiration. So I wondered, how would this become possible? What were these ideas that Dunant represented, a kind of old, strong tradition? Or was there something really new and original about what Obama was doing in embracing humane war? So I went back and I looked at that 19th century moment when Dunant had this revolutionary idea of using, in particular, international law to make war less brutal. And I was entranced not by him, who came to seem to me pretty dubious for reasons we could get into, but by one of his great critics, the Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy. Amazingly, Tolstoy has one of his immortal characters, Prince Andrei, in War and Peace, attack the Geneva Convention. Not directly, but I think it's fairly clear, and you can argue that the timing is right, for that to be what Prince Andrei in War and Peace denounces when he says, I wouldn't embark on this enterprise of trying to make war more humane. It's a mistake. Now, what I do at the beginning of the book is I, kind of look at Tolstoy's career, especially as it evolves after War and Peace in the 1860s, as Tolstoy becomes the world famous pacifist and vegetarian, because I think it's in this later phase in his career that he kind of offers some useful worries, although they turned out to be premature, concerning the project of humanizing war. It sounds like it's unobjectionable, noble, deserving of the first Nobel Peace Prize. But Tolstoy had various doubts. And I think at the core of his doubt was the worry, which seems hard to refute as a worry, that humanizing evil could perpetuate it. I don't think that's in itself a very interesting idea. I think it's broadly accepted. Just as an example, death penalty activists have debated what if, in trying to make the administration of the death penalty in this country less cruel, they make it harder to end as such. And they debate openly with one another, whether to take these more humanizing steps to court the risk of entrenching the death penalty. And they come out in various ways. What I think Tolstoy did, which was more original, is think about some ways in which this risk could be incurred. Note in passing that the argument is just that there's a risk. Whether it's incurred depends on a lot of things. And so what I think Tolstoy was brilliant about was what could be some ways in which the risk could be incurred. And I'll just cover briefly these two analogies he pursues to try to get at how making a violent practice less brutal could actually be a mistake, could incur intolerable risks. So his first analogy, when he attacks the project of making a war more humane, is the prior legal agenda, which had predominated in the later 18th and early 19th centuries among reformers across the Atlantic, of making chattel slavery more humane. There hadn't been much of an abolitionist movement for a while, and reformers, some of whom were abolitionists, most of whom were not, tried to make chattel slavery less cruel. And looking back, Tolstoy worries that was a mistake, that the evil was so significant, so undeniable that it was worth holding out for the crystallization of an abolitionist movement, especially if, as several historians have actually substantiated, making chattel slavery more humane did give it a new lease on life. But what I like most about Tolstoy's analogy is like a story about reformers that he tells, which I'll just call the advocate's compromise. The idea works like this. If I'm an advocate, I want to make the world a better place. I may compromise with my enemy. You can have human property, I'll say, and in exchange, I'll exact a concession from you. You'll agree to a new law that limits the brutality with which you can treat that human property. Tolstoy's argument was that this, in a way, did make the world a better place, but at a high price because it helped the slave owner. It may or may not have facilitated slaveholding, but it made it seem more legitimate to some people for whom the cruelty of the practice was the vile thing. And once humanized, it was more tolerable and therefore harder to get them to side with you in opposing it as an abolitionist. So that's the advocate's compromise. And then he gives the second, I think, really interesting analogy, which is to non-human animal slaughter. And here I think he's isolating a dynamic that I call the beneficiary's bad faith. His main idea is that, when he goes to look at slaughterhouses, including new, allegedly humane ones, he says, people out there in the world will now think that because their prey, the violence being inflicted on that prey for their sake, is more humane, they're better people. So this is about the audience or beneficiary of the evil or violence. And it's about how they fool themselves when they know or are told that the violence that helps them is less brutal than before. And he says that's a mistake because it could perpetuate the practice. It could entrench the practice. Now, all of these claims are really debatable, but the analogy is that, well, maybe the same could happen in war. To the extent that it's made more humane, the audience for it, or the audience for those politicians who tout its newly humanized form, could accept it more easily. And we just have to check, is that true? How big an input into the perpetuation of the evil or violence, or in our case, war, does that cause? So I don't want to leave the 19th century, even though I have precious few minutes left, without acknowledging that, whether these arguments apply to the cases Tolstoy cited, let alone to war, is highly debatable. And we have to acknowledge the counter argument that maybe humanizing practices could make them more visible as evil things, and therefore easier, not harder to end. So Dunant's successor at the Red Cross, he should have won the Nobel Prize because of his long service in inventing the organization, named Gustave Moyn, also Swiss, says to his funders, look, I've just got my foot in the door through making war more humane. I'm an indirect pacifist. I'm going to control war because once soldiers acknowledge the humanity of their targets, how can they kill them? How can we sustain war once it's humanized? Well, it was a nice, maybe noble conjecture. I think it proved mistaken. And we're in really good position to know that now, when it turns out that humanized violence in some cases and war in our American case is more sustainable, has been more sustainable. So just really briefly, I think there's a long time to wait before you can take Tolstoy seriously on war, just because war is not effectively made more humane at all until very recently. The law, mostly after that first Geneva Convention of 1864, doesn't call for it to be more humane. Most of the law of war is about allowing militaries to injure and kill as much as they want, with very few limits. And that was only in transatlantic, Christian on Christian, white on white warfare, because there was also a second track, especially in colonial or global war, in which the rules didn't apply to non-Christian and non-white enemies anyway. And then finally, even to the very minor extent, there were humanizing limits in the early laws of war. They were disregarded when push came to shove, World War II and World War I before it. Interestingly, there are people who said, it's a mistake, we should focus on controlling force before there's any humane war to speak of. H.G. Wells is an excellent example. But in my judgment, I mean, the purpose of the book as a history is to substantiate this judgment. Tolstoy was just way too early a prophet. What changed, I think, is that first decolonization happened, and the victims of, global war without limitation on its conduct got free, and then got to help make the law, having borne the brunt of it. And they actually mainly, as at Nuremberg, wanted to control force, but they also pushed to make war during the Cold War, which was a global violent event, more humane than it had been. And they push these new treaties that are boringly called the Additional Protocols, the Geneva Conventions. They're from 1977. I think that's the first treaty that does something fundamental to make war humane on paper. First, by prohibiting the targeting of civilians. Amazingly, that had not been done clearly before the 1970s, hence air war and the aerial bombardment in all prior wars, including American wars, especially in the Pacific, of civilians, direct targeting. And then there's a limit on how many civilians you can kill collaterally, which is pioneered in those treaties. West Europeans get on board with the new states and the communist states because they've lost their wars of decolonization, aren't ruling the world anymore, don't have brutal wars to fight, and so why not ascend to a kind of moral high ground, which West Europeans have done lately. And then you get, I think, the American story, which is interesting because for decades at this point, pivoting beyond its so-called isolationism, the US has been fighting global brutal wars. And yet humanitarians arise after the kind of decline of anti-war energies in the Vietnam era, who commit to making war more humane. Human Rights Watch is like a great symbol of this because it commits never to pronouncing on the rights or wrongs, legality or illegality of the initiation of any wars, but to monitor their conduct. And the US military, I think, is the most amazing actor because shamed by My Lai, it self-humanizes. It takes the newly humane laws of war seriously like never before, whether out of ethical or optical concern. And the results are brutal, but more humane than before. And so you get, even before 9/11, a kind of context for something new, which is a new kind of humane war with less and less constraint on whether it's fought, for how long it lasts, where it goes. And that's in the end what happened after September 11th, in my judgment. Briefly, there were two wars on terror. in military history. There was the first one, which involved heavy footprint intervention in two countries, Afghanistan and Iraq, massive numbers of troops. Of course, noxiously, it involved an attempt to dodge the law calling for more humanity in warfare in various ways, notably with respect to torture. But that form of the war was brief. And it was replaced by a new form of the war on terror, both in the later Bush years and then in Barack Obama's presidency. It was light footprint with a massive turn to the use of special forces, small teams of men who, through the end of Obama's administration in 2016, were setting foot in 70% of the countries in the world. That figure reached 80% under Donald Trump's presidency. And then more famously, no footprint warfare, which among other techniques involved armed drones. And there are, lots to say about this second form of the war on terror. I just want to single out that it was less visible. It went many more places than the initial two that Bush invaded with lots of troops, and it dragged on endlessly. And the legal authorities set up to allow it to drag on endlessly and in more places remain on the American books. What's significant to me is that claims around the humanity of the enterprise were central. Now, how causally important were they? We can have that debate. But it matters a lot to me that in the two main speeches that Obama gave about the war on terror, first that Peace Prize address, then his drones address 4 years later at the National Defense University, the substance was that he had brought a new humane form of war to the world. He bragged about it. He did not remark on where it went, how long it was lasting, but said that America's trademark now, after Bush, after torture, after Guantanamo, which Bush had already reduced to a shadow of a former self, its former self, would be humanity, including adherence to the Geneva Convention. There was an amazing event, and it's here I'll close, at that National Defense University address when a peace activist named Medea Benjamin accosted Obama. I think it was the most dramatic moment of Obama's whole presidency in foreign affairs. And yet, even though a peace activist, she complained in her heckling before she was removed that the war was too brutal. The drones were killing too many civilians. That was the central argument of many who wanted to impose some limits on US warfare at this time. After she was thrown out, Obama said the following, the real problem is endless war. What happens to states? What happens to empires when they fight endlessly at their peripheries? What happens at their core? This was years before anyone could imagine what could happen. And yet it was in a way prophetic. But then, of course, the whole point of the address was to roll out humanizing rules that would govern a permanent killing program, once a practice seen as noxious globally, that has been normalized now and is arguably illegal, whether or not it's humanely administered. And so in my judgment, that's where we are. And there's no credible proof I can provide that absent the degradation of the constraints on force in the world, Putin wouldn't have added insult to injury. Maybe he would have invaded Ukraine anyway. But tons of damage has been done by the West, as Putin correctly pointed out, to the Nuremberg consensus. And then the question is for us, is it good enough that we've struggled to make the wars more humane in compensation? The standard answer is we need to make them more humane. And of course, that's true, because there's still a lot of violations beyond what Obama promised. And those are egregious, but they're not the main violation. They're not the gateway crime. And it's to that I think we should return. So just to, end on a cautionary note, I'm not saying making war humane is bad. I'm saying, as Tolstoy did, it courts a risk. And so if we don't control or manage the risk, we may incur it. The risk of entrenching our wars, the worst thing we do. Okay, thanks very much.
Before Ellen Weiner gives his commentary, I wanted to remind people on Zoom that if you put your questions into the Q&A function, I'll be able to read them. I'll be calling on people in the room, but also reading off some of the questions from the Zoom audience. Ellen.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. I think Scott told me I only have about 45 minutes, so I'll try to be brief. Humane. Wow. I mean, this is really, an impressive and an important book, which offers powerful and original insights into this relationship between efforts of international humanitarian law to minimize the suffering of war and our tolerance for the existence of war itself. It's an extremely thought-provoking book for those of us who work on law of war issues, in some respects unsettling in the best way, of course, and that it forces us to re-examine beliefs that perhaps we've embraced and espoused, without too much critical reflection. And so in this regard, I will just confess, I'm still grappling with my own reactions to some of the claims in the book. But again, just congratulations on a really tremendous intellectual achievement. Really, I'm a big fan. So, having said that, of course, now we expect some comment and critique. And so that's what I'll provide now. A couple of points. First, and you've adverted to it already during your, in the book and in your remarks. First, of course, is, and in my mind, foremost, is this empirical question. You said how causally important in your remarks, how causally important is the humanization of war to the incidence of war? And you said we can debate that. I think we should debate that, right? Because that's maybe what makes this book important. The book sets out, of course, two views. One we might call the Clausewitzian or the Liberian view, that the more violent a war is, the more likely it is to be of short duration and thus ultimately the most humane, right? Lieber says sharp wars are brief. The other view, which I think is perhaps your view, although I want to ask, is that by making wars more humane, we make them more likely to occur or at least to continue. Again, I think the book embraces the second view in arguing that America's endless global violence is in part, quote, due to the reformist zeal for humane war. Again, one of the things and I think I understand a question I had asked is like, where do you come out on the empirical question? And it sounds like from your remarks, it's like, well, it's maybe too soon to say, right? We don't maybe have an answer to that. The title of the book, I think, asks us to consider how the United States abandoned peace and reinvented war, which doesn't necessarily imply that humanization causes war. It suggests a different kind of causal relationship than a subtitle that reads, how the United States reinvented war and abandoned peace, right? Yet I think the entire logic of the book seems to suggest that humanizing war has caused the incidence of war to increase and the duration of war to expand. Otherwise, I'm not sure what we make of the claim, on page 12, that the story of humanization of war is about how bad things can happen to people who want to be good. And again, you refer to the malign consequences in your remarks just now of the shift to the humanization of war. Okay, so what's the evidence of this relationship? Well, I don't know either. But just in thinking about remarks today, I mean, I thought, like, how would we begin to go about trying to answer that question, right? So I took a quick look at the Congressional Research Service study on instances of the use of the United States Armed Force, right, which goes back to the founding of the Republic, most recently updated in March of this year. This is admittedly a very crude empirical approach. It's why they don't let law professors do empirical work. Actually, for those of you who don't know these things, so we're prohibited by the law school from our contracts from doing empirical work. But I looked at the uses of force between World War I and World War II, which is 27 years, and counted 19 overseas uses of force in the 27 years after the adoption of the Geneva Conventions, right? The next 27 years, 1977 to 2004, the number of uses of force is admittedly higher, 32, but it's not a fundamental change, and it doesn't support the notion that the humanization of war has fundamentally changed our expectations about war. Or think about another way, empirically, that we might assess the relationship between the humanization of war and the incidence and duration of war, a comparative approach. If we go back to the start of the Second Chechenian War, right, in 1999, a few years before our own embrace and the war on the so-called sogenannte War on Terror in 2011, and we run through Georgia and Chechnya and Crimea, Donbass in 2014, and Ukraine today, Russia has also been involved in more or less endless conflict since 1999. Yet I don't think Russia's endless war can be explained by the human way or the humane way in which those wars have been fought. Now, you might say, look, as a rejoinder, you might say, hey, look, my book is about the United States. It says so right there, on the book jacket, right? So it's not fair, but the rules that we're talking about, of course, are universal. And so I think we need to be reflective and careful about how we assess them, or if we're assessing them only in light of their potential impact on the United States, as important as that might be. Second, a question. To the extent the United States has come to tolerate endless war and to abandon peace, assuming that is a correct conclusion, is it right to focus on humanization as an important reason? I mean, it's clearly the case that the nature of war has changed, drones, special forces, the features that you identified. But if we no longer clamor for peace as a public in this country, despite this endless war, I doubt quite strongly that it's because the war is less inhumane to those against whom we wage it. Rather, it's because today's way of fighting reduces the cost to our own soldiers. And the existence of an all-volunteer force means that only those of us who choose to bear the costs of war are called upon to do so. In short, it's the fact that we've reduced the harm of war to ourselves rather than to our enemies through the application of international humanitarian law, I would argue, that would make endless war seem more palatable. I'm going to skip point 3 to make sure that there's room for commentary. I'll just conclude with this. I do worry about the policy or the public relations implications. I know that we're all law professors and we're supposed to not think about these things, right? But we're all on Twitter, right? And I worry about the implications of a book that, fairly or not, will be read in the broader culture as saying, notwithstanding your last slide, that laws that make war more humane are bad because they lead to more war. That will be, in 288 characters, I think, the takeaway. Now, you argue that Michael Walzer, to the extent he suggested, and Moyn, to the extent he suggested that war could promote peace, is being proved wrong, right? But you also do seem to note at different points of the text that it's equally speculative about whether making war more brutal will make it shorter. The argument, as it unfolds in the second half of the book, seems to focus less on the impact of the humanization of IHL on the conduct of war, but really more on the implications for the focus and strategy of human rights activists. Now, that might have a secondary impact on the implications, but we've now stepped away from the impact of the rules on how war is conducted. So perhaps where that leaves me, even though, as I said, I'm still grappling with the book, is here. If we don't know whether humanization, in fact, affects the incidence or the duration of wars, isn't humane war better than inhumane war? And that's where I'll stop with my reflections.
A response, and then
Sure.
and people can raise their hands.
No, first off, thank you. Those are terrific comments. So, if you saddle me with a series of claims I'm not making, I join you in refuting them. So I just want to emphasize, because everything you say sounded persuasive to me, with just one minor example, a counterexample, that I want to make a really modest claim. Now, first, I want to, in a sense, and we could be empirical. And of course, those are really popular assumptions in a building like this. I don't really share them. And so I didn't set out to like precisely assign causality, although I'm sure it's a great effort, even if I'm skeptical of it in general. What I thought I could do is say, look, there are these worrywarts who pointed out this possibility that we'd court a risk. And then it's up to us to decide as actors in the absence of proof, how much we suspect it's a real risk when we've courted it. And of course, if political scientists want to thought, he also thought was the right answer. How did the virtues of an America that, unlike any other great power in human history, is committed to making its wars more humane? And it went to an amazing extent. I'll just mention, I didn't in the talk, that the rules that he set out in that address in 2013 went beyond the laws of war. As you know, he promised that targeted killing would never occur if there was any risk of collateral harm. Now, one response is that that was a lie. Another is that it's amazing he told it, because it went way beyond what the law required, which was merely to avoid disproportionate harm to the military advantage you would derive from the strike. That's what those additional protocols. So I asked, who was he talking to? And I think the answer is all the liberals I know who opposed George W. Bush, not because he was starting a world war, but because it was morally egregious in its conduct to them, as well as to some victims. And then all those who rested content for some number of years with a more humane form of that war, which Obama brought them, instead of, the peace that for which he stood as a candidate in 2008. So I don't know. I mean, I think the burden is on those who doubt the significance of this, not to say, Sam, you haven't proved it's at the top of the list in explaining why we don't have peace, why we have American war. Because of course it's not at the top of the list causally. It's on the list somewhere, and it matters in a historically original way, which it's my job to identify as a historian looking for change over time. Now, the risk for my own argument is it's just rhetoric. Well, even that's significant. I still think if you're using rhetoric to legitimate violence, it's because it's likely causal, or you think it is. Okay, the small point on which I might differ from you is that it's not about human rights activists who are given much less attention in this book than the military. Again, it's absolutely staggering in world history that you'd have military lawyers picking targets, which began in the first Gulf War and is absolutely central to the drone program. And that's because the military came to agree with its own lawyers that legalizing the conduct of the fight was central to its legitimation, if only to itself and in a new version of the warrior's honor, but probably to a much wider audience. And I think, this is just a small comment. But, if you remember Colin Powell, his concern was no more Vietnam. Let's not let where he led the military. in his role in the initiation of the Iraq War. He didn't care how humane it was going to be as much, but it was really central to him as Secretary of State to push back against torture from the first, actually. And he was on the right side of history on that one. And yet his larger end of keeping the US military, all the veterans,
Then we say who's going to come next so that we can know who to pass the mic to. So Shirin Sanar, I have you first, and then Herb Lynn will be after you.
Hi, my name is Shirin Sanar. Can you just
Wait for the mic so the people.
Thank you. Shireen, I teach at Stanford Law School. And so I very much share your critique of endless war. But I feel like maybe the version of the argument that you made here today seemed a little less pointed than the one in your book, at least in the sections on post 9/11 human rights lawyering, where it seemed to me that there was a much stronger claim being made that the Center for Constitutional Rights and other human rights lawyers actually hand in hand inadvertently with the government lawyers and the John Hughes of the world, created this scenario in which war was humanized and therefore prolonged. So I wonder if your claim has shifted a little bit, or just the force with which you make it, just because it seems to me that there's a big difference between saying there's a potential for legalizing or humanizing reform to actually prolong the thing that you're really concerned about, and the claim that it's happened. And you note that, but it seemed to me that the claim initially had been a stronger claim. And part of, I guess, maybe just one quick follow up to that is I wondered if you could speak a little bit about the counterfactual. So, if, for example, human rights lawyers had not pushed back on Guantanamo detentions or other abuses that were coming to light, do you think that in like I just like to hear that sort of the chain of reasoning to think that war would therefore have been uh, not as prolonged. Like it seems I'm having a hard time understanding that connection. I think at the time that CCR, Michael Ratner, other human rights lawyers pushed back on the practices of the Bush administration, not many people were. Yes, there was an anti-war movement that occasionally raised its head, but especially not in January of 2002, when the Guantanamo detainees were starting to come in to Guantanamo. There was not much pushback. And so the human rights claims were a wedge in order to shed light on a system that was largely not even being criticized.
is it one on? Do I answer?
Yeah, you answer.
Okay.
I'm
No,
trying to-
I didn't really, I don't think it's different from what I said. I just didn't engage that part of the argument very much. That's, but which I stand by basically. I guess I would say a few things. So what attracted me to the story about that particular activist and group was that it was unlike mainstream human rights activism, precisely because Michael Ratner and to doing so. So they're exactly like the early activists who made slavery work. They don't they don't see an alternative. They don't have an abolitionist possibility. And so they participate in a tragedy, potentially very long lasting consequences of making the enterprise more lawful. And I think, through Obama's genius and understanding the moral moment in making the conduct of it more humane. Now, we would need some empiricism in a different sense than Alan invoked to kind of go back and relive that period properly. Because I think there were a lot of different kinds of activists. One kind just opposed torture on principle and thought it was the worst thing you could do, not war, but torture. And they were, let's say, narrowly focused because they had an intrinsic reason to oppose the conduct of hostilities, especially when it involved Guantanamo and torture elsewhere. Then there were those, I think, who were attempting to be canny strategists who thought, I can attack a war, but I can delegitimate it by illustrating its brutality and dramatizing it. And I just want to point out that that appears to have succeeded only partly or failed. Because if you point out that a practice is brutal, you can delegitimate it, or you can lead the bug to be removed from the program, and the war, in this case, to be made more humane. And that was part of their legacy. Now, of course, it's Obama who understands that it can be and acts to transform the war in the way they did, but it was in an environment that activists helped create. Finally, there were some others who said, look, American war is not evil, it's Bush's war, Bush's version of it. And that described a lot of liberal Democrats. And they joined in this coalition with the principled and the strategic, and they won because they got their war. And so I don't think we can afford to, to miss going back and saying, what were the choices made? Were they necessary? If they were necessary, were they tragic? I think so.
We're getting some comments in the chat saying that your microphone's not picking up well, so I'm going to switch microphones with you and see if this helps. It's less important if they hear me.
Well, I would dispute that.
It's okay now if someone says. Good. Okay. Herb Lynn.
And who
Jim
gets it next
Goldgeier.
after this so that I can pass it on?
Yeah, Jim Goldgeier after you.
Hi, I'm Herb Lynn. I'm a physicist with CSAC and do a lot of emerging technology stuff in security. And it struck me that you were silent on the role or the interaction with what you're saying and technology. I would suggest that a large part of American military hardware investment over the past 50 years has been devoted to making weapons more and more technologically precise and humane and, more precise, less collateral damage, all that, the low yield submarine launched ballistic missile, nuclear warhead and so on and so forth, all with the claim that it makes the stuff much more usable because it'll kill fewer people, it'll kill fewer innocent people. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts or comments about how technology interacts with your argument.
Tons of thoughts. My general view is that we should repudiate, the thesis that technology drives morality and insist that it's the other way around, because we used to want to kill lots of people, especially if they were non-Christian and non-white. We celebrated when we did so, and our munitions makers understood that the goal was to develop maximally brutal technologies of war, like napalm, as just one example among many. And I would argue that while there's an old dream of precision, especially in aerial bombardment, which I talk about in the book, the main goal was not precision, but not precision. The old days being, most of the history of the 20th century. And then there's some mutation. And I think it does have to do with a response to the Vietnam War and really a rethinking of World War II, which put civilian death at its moral center. And also decolonization, which made the moral status of non-Christian and non-white peoples globally higher for Christians and whites than it had been. And that that prompts technological change in a different direction. And, Raytheon et al. Make drones. And I think that's the story. It's more plausible to me than thinking that, well, it just wasn't possible technologically to care. People didn't care, and then they did, and technology followed. That's my argument. But of course, I know there are a lot of people who think that technology creates our possibilities rather than ourselves.
Norman Neymar. Oh, Jim, and then Norman's after Jim, so you can pass it.
Gotcha. Okay, Jim Goldgeier, visiting scholar here at CSAC, and really interested in your presentation. I just wanted to hear a response to Alan's point about the importance of the lessened costs to us.
Oh, yes. Okay.
I very interesting your discussion of Obama. I think at least as interesting is the generation on the left just before Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, Yoshka Fisher, the
Absolutely.
anti-Vietnam,
Yeah.
war is bad, uncomfortable with the use of military force, who, with the Kosovo War, I mean, the Kosovo War to me is a really important war for so many reasons,
Yes.
not the least of which the impact on US-Russia relations, but let's set that aside for the moment. But this idea that you could use the military for humanitarian purposes with little cost, I mean, no combat casualties
Exactly.
in the
Yeah.
Kosovo War. And, for a group of people like Clinton and Blair and some in Germany who had not been comfortable with the idea of using force, this was a dream. And we also should remember on Kosovo, I mean, not only did Bernie Sanders support the Kosovo War when it happened, but when he was asked about it in the 2020 campaign, he reiterated that, yeah, he still supported what we did in Kosovo. And just the last thing I would just mention on Kosovo, just because I'm very interested in that particular war and the politics around it. My understanding is that in fighting the war, all of the targets had to go through the North Atlantic Council and be decided on by the North Atlantic Council before the bombing runs. And that this was frustrating to the US military. And in fact, one of the reasons why the Bush administration decided not to go through NATO to do the Afghanistan war was because of this belief that that process slowed things down and they didn't want to deal with that in the Afghanistan war.
Okay, great comments. So just first on Alan's really important point, absolutely, it's true that on the list of factors higher than rhetorical or real humanization is the immunization of American combat troops from harm. And of course, he comes into office and understands that Bush's popularity is tanked because of the body bags coming home, and resolves not to do that, not to incur that risk. But when he talks about the war, he doesn't brag about keeping American servicemen and women safe. He brags about care for the victims. And, again, I can't prove, no one can disprove how big a factor it was that he focused in that way rather than, let's say, more honestly about why he was transforming the war in the way he did. But of course, he also transformed it in humanizing directions, through these rules about, targeted killings and so forth. So again, it goes back to my general answer to Alan, which was it's on the list. It's not the most important. I don't think it was adequately talked about at the time or since. And so I wanted to. But this isn't like a comprehensive account of American war. Okay, on your broader point, no, Kosovo absolutely transformative, and I think it created a kind of optimism that we could make the world a better place in the mantra of the show and probably real place nearby Silicon Valley, without dirtying our hands and especially not killing our own, pilots and without troops on the ground. Uh, so that's clearly right. And then we go back to why aggression was the problem. It's because when you allow, in a more latitudinarian way, uses of force, you create the risks of pretext by other actors, including your own future politicians. And so, again, I said I was involved in Kosovo in the most minor way, and it seemed like a good idea at the time. But then we stop the clock in 2003 and begin to revisit that premise. And then we stop it in 2022 when Putin directly invokes it as precedent for his own illegality. And we begin to revisit it. And at what point does the abusive pretextual claim that we can advance humanity, notwithstanding binding rules on the use of force, become something that has made the world worse, not better? Especially if Kosovo is like one of the only humanitarian interventions you can even credibly claim all by itself made a difference for the better, not the worse. Great point on Bush and NATO, which I actually didn't know, so really appreciate it.
Jim, you and Steve may have an answer to this, but do you see Putin's use of U.S. acts, which even the State Department said was legitimate, but did not say it was legal? Do you view that as purely pretextual, or and that he knows that's not a strong argument, or do you view it as really causal? Norman, you may have a view on this. I'm looking at people I know who speak Russian and read Russian and follow the news in this area.
Well, I mean, just on Kosovo, I just think it's just a really important war that people don't pay enough attention to. And I mean, whenever I have a conversation with people about NATO enlargement, I always say, if you look at 1999 when the first post-Cold War members came in, the Kosovo War was a much bigger deal for the Russians than the entry of Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic into NATO. I mean, because it, going around or without the UN Security Council authorization, you're diminishing Russia's, veto power, its great power status through the United Nations. And I think also, with Iraq coming just 4 years later, again without UN Security Council authorization, I think you really have to put these together as just grading on Putin and people like him that here's the US, doing whatever it wants and nobody can stop it. And especially Russia can't stop it. And I think it is a big deal. It doesn't, I mean, I still think we should have done the Kosovo War, not the Iraq War. And it doesn't, I mean, obviously what he's done in Ukraine, I don't think has any bearing on that. But I think it did great on him and others around him.
And he's mentioned it many times, not just this last speech.
Stephen, introduce yourself.
Steve Piper, I'm a William Perry Fellow here at Stanford and former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine. But I think it grates more on Putin now than it grated on him, say, back in the early 2000s. I mean, I was still in the government in 2003, and the Russians, they weren't happy about Iraq, but it was interesting. I think in part they were torn because the West divided. The U.S. and the British were prepared to go in, and the Germans and French were saying no. And in fact, when the Russians actually sent a mission to Washington, to talk to us about it, their big concerns were what happens to our debt after the war, and are we going to be thrown out of the oil market? But it wasn't a really big moral issue. So a part of this, I think, is Putin now, it grates on him more now because Kosovo, I think, is a different question. But I think, but even now, I think he plays it up more than he was doing, back. And of course, Kosovo happened before his watch.
And back to Norman. Wait for the mic. And then Luis Rodriguez is after Norman.
Well, this may be more Kosovo than you need, but that's was almost exactly the same, set of questions that Jim brought up and have brought others to mind. I think it's not a good argument. I mean, personally, I do not think it's a good argument to say, Putin saying it's Kosovo now, to say that there was something wrong with Kosovo in 1999. I think that's an absolute mistake.
It's just that it's illegal, which it
Well,
was.
it was illegal for very concrete reasons, that the Russians wouldn't have approved of it because they were
Sure.
supporting the Serbs in the conflict in the Balkans.
Sure.
So you couldn't go to the UN. I mean, that's why it was illegal.
Well, but
Just
that's
like
what
it
the
would be
law
illegal.
is.
There's a lot of that would be illegal in the Ukraine case, because you can't go to the UN to get approval for certain kinds of actions.
True,
So,
true.
I personally, I mean, we don't want to argue Kosovo now,
Right.
but I personally think you're dead wrong. I mean, but we can talk about it maybe afterwards. But let me try to put that into a broader kind of question, which you brought up, which has to. By the way, it was a marvelous presentation. I have to read the book, and it's really. I think you really hit on something really important. With this question of trying to introduce more humanitarian warfare. I mean, that's the essence of your book, and that strikes me as really, super important. And I'll try to read about it as soon as I can. But I wanted to know, how you think about justifiable war and unjustifiable war, and how that fits in then to this question of making war more humane, if it does at all, or are these two separate kinds of questions? Again, I'm trying to lift the Kosovo,
Right.
question out, out of the specificities of Kosovo and talk in a more, general way, and also the question of intervention of the sort that I think Kosovo was,
Yes.
and also
Yes.
eventually in Bosnia,
Yep.
and how that fits into this dynamic. I guess that's the more general issue.
Do you want to say something first,
No,
or?
I'm trying to get Scott's attention
Oh,
for two fingers, but we should hear the answer.
No, so this is central, Norman, and I'll just say a few brief things, but this is an inexhaustible topic. So, one is that Americans, like to discuss in let's say the freestanding morality of their wars, and not talk a lot about what the law currently is, and if you don't like it, you either have to have a principled reason to break it, or you could change the rules to make them, conform better with the morality you bring to the situation. But, there is this old just war tradition, which allowed war for a series of reasons, mostly in retrospect, bad ones. And then, part of the book narrates how people struggled to constrain the allowable reasons for states to resort to force. Today, there are only two: self-defense. We'd have to get into what that means and how Americans have expanded what counts, and UN Security Council authorization. Humanitarian intervention is illegal. Now, should it be? Well, if something's illegal that we think ought to be legalized, like marijuana, we have to agitate to change the law. Maybe there's going to be a case for breaking it now and then. We could ignore the law if we're powerful enough not to get caught, or not have, not to get it enforced against us. I guess, my general take, my perspective in this book is that I haven't seen any American just wars in my lifetime. I've only seen ones that have made the world worse, even when they're allegedly undertaken out of the best intentions. And I also reflect that even if there are some in that category, which could be like a null set, you have this risk of, abusive, pretextual acts by others, bad presidents, George W. Bush, Donald Trump, and foreign leaders, Vladimir Putin. And I just think, we we have to care about the overall permissive environment unless we think that war makes the world a better place. And I just, it seems to me the evidence is extremely clear that almost no wars do. Even in, I think, the incredibly rare case where we might claim there's like a philosophical case for the justice of a war, whatever its relation to the current laws on the use of force, we have to ask, well, what else was going on? And, as far as I can see, those who've claimed those rationales have been betrayed by the unfolding of the wars that they've supported, which have generally made the world worse and have not advanced the moral ends that were supposed to be advanced by them. So I guess my response to your amazing challenge would be, if you present me with some just wars lately, so Ukraine is engaged in self-defense, and I think that's right. So I said American wars. Now America,
In the Balkans, you don't think that was just our involvement in the Balkans? Just out of curiosity.
well, so there was a belated use of aerial force to bring Milosevic to the table at Dayton.
Is that unjust?
I think it had a huge amount of support. And the same has been true very selectively of other acts. And again, remember, there's UN Charter authorization. I think Kosovo is the one that for me falls into a different category because it didn't. And the same was true of what happened in Libya, in the end. And that's a really significant case, I think, for Putin too, because he didn't veto that one. And yet he saw what happened. And the Chinese also witnessed what happened in Libya and said, we're not getting fooled again. Why was there no Syria resolution? Which seems like it would be a far better case for some kind of humanitarian intervention or even regime change than any of the prior ones. And yet these prior acts by the West made it impossible. So I guess, let's just say the just wars are few enough and far between enough that maybe we ought to not have the unjust ones, at least some of them, and not only worry about whether the wars, just or unjust, are brutal, too brutal.
We have a two-finger from Alan Weiner and then Luis. That's okay. Keep the microphone.
I've already spoken, so I'll make mine a one finger, and why don't, if you
Okay.
can put me on the queue.
Okay, you're on the queue.
leave room for others.
My name is Luis Rodriguez. I'm a Stanton Nuclear Security Postdoctoral Fellow here at CSAC. Thanks a lot for the presentation and also for the book. And thanks also for actually paying attention to the Global South after decolonization and how the US engaged with those arguments. I'm an expert on Latin American participations on limiting the use of war. So let me bring you to a Latin American argument from the 30s and the 40s.
Okay.
So Latin American lawyers saw US war federalism with some skepticism. Latin Americans argued that abolishing war and universalizing peace was all good, but that there is no peace in a war with asymmetries because inequalities will lead to violence anyway. So Latin Americans decided to participate and very actively in the Geneva Conventions, saying that, well, if we want limit inequalities, let's at least limit the violence.
Right.
So I can imagine those Latin Americans, international lawyers saying, well, the book is very good and all of that, but if we are not going to attack the roots of violence, isn't having some regulations on violence at least like an imperfect but existing good?
Right.
Or in other words, how do you prevent the ossification of inequalities in the name of universalizing peace? Thanks.
I love the question. Thank you. So just as a prefatory note, following the Latin Americans, once there are more new states, they really want to prioritize control of force. And they observe things like, the UN Charter has a lot of shortcomings. It was a great power piece that may have solved the transatlantic war problem, but at the price of perpetuating the global war problem and Americanizing it, since America ended up doing, more of the global warfare than it had before. Although, of course, there's its own record of Latin American intervention and so forth. It's true, though, that Latin American states and the newer states of the global South said, we will also want to push for more humane war, since we may not succeed on our first aim. And so long before you have these, philosophers thinking about this, Michael Walzer and then the later crop of revisionists, I think these actors are understandably pushing for more humane war as on kind of lesser evil or second best grounds. And of course it's right to do so. If we're going to have slavery that we can't end, then it would be preferable to have a more humane version of it. But the question is, does that come at a cost that we didn't take seriously? And that's the risk I'm raising. And so this would be a critique of those actors and others like them if they settle, if they understate the possibility of constraining at least some force, and they court or incur this risk that I'm talking about. And so this is my book, my work in general is in the spirit of trying to give these states some love, since they had the best legal agenda we've seen to date in general. But that doesn't mean that anyone's above mistake.
I have a question from the Zoom that follows up on this, especially the analogy to slavery.
Yeah.
Would you argue that the Civil War was or was not a just war, according to your logic? The U.S. Civil War.
Well, sure. No, I think there are just wars, and that's one, and it's a really interesting one. It arises in my book, since before they had to make a choice, the same millennialist Christians who powered the anti-slavery movement across the United States. Civil War, and they came out in different places. I mean, preferably it would have been great to abolish slavery without a civil war, especially since, to the best of my understanding, we're not beyond the legacy of slavery. And so I would say, we wouldn't want to pose the choice in a way that, ruled out a kind of better alternative in which we make moral progress without the occasional just war that we've thought necessary in the past. And, even if there are some such, like the US Civil War, when push comes to shove, most of these wars don't contribute to moral progress. So those are the ones.
It was a two finger on the Kosovo issue, and I was in the government at the time. It was interesting, in terms of history. Shireen Sinar, before she came to Stanford Law School, was a human rights lawyer, and I was in the national security. I was a lawyer in the State Department. So, but I wanted to broaden it because of the question. I also thought, we found out, Luis would say something more interesting than I'm going to say. So, the question is, what is the effect of violations of the law on the integrity and the viability of the law, right? So this is what's triggered by the Kosovo case. And this is something Scott and I have talked about a lot. Tom Frank in his book, has this idea that, like, well, maybe they're kind of excusable breaches or cases where, yes, you're technically engaging in violation, but that can be overlooked or mitigated because you have a plausible justification. So what are the implications, of that, for Kosovo? And here's the two finger part. Again, violations could lead to the vitiation of the law. But I think in the case of Russia, I just don't think it's really plausible to say that Russia was a really law-abiding country that was really committed to respect for the rule of international law, like see Hungary see Czechoslovakia, and like it's only after the invasion of or the bombing of Kosovo, that Russia says, like, oh my God, the law isn't really, isn't viable anymore, and so now we're going to disregard it. I don't think that explains what's going on. I do think the Russians are outraged by, and I think this also explains part of the reason why we don't have as much support as we would like on the Russian invasion of Ukraine from the global south. It's just America's hypocrisy that people kind of find intolerable, right? It's like you've been preaching to me all the time in this sanctimonious way about the rule of law and the rules-based order. And I think that's what really gets under Putin's skin, right? It's not so much I don't believe in the law. I don't know if I ever believed in the law, but I'm just tired of having you use the law, right, as a cudgel, right, when you're so your own record is so problematic. Now, here's my question, Sam, for you. Why is Putin's like arguments about problematic U.S. uses of force in your slide deck for this book, which is about a jus ad bellum question, right? It's all about law governing recourse to force. And your point is that humanizing war may or may not, right? We have to be mindful of the effect that humanizing war. Why does using force illegally fit? I actually was like genuinely confused about how that's part of the story that you're telling.
Right. So, I mean, it's absolutely central, and a third of the book is about building constraints on recourse to war in the first place, leading to the UN
Right.
Charter. And that's because the argument is that what's at stake, the risk that you might incur, is that you would have illegal wars that make the world worse on balance and involve a lot of death of soldiers and legal death of civilians and budgetary misspending and regional destabilization, all legal once an illegal war or even a legal one starts. But to me, the question is fundamentally, is there a cost to the jus ad bellum, the constraint on force going to war, when we focus on making their conduct more humane? So it's absolutely central to worry about that. Now, I want to make one thing clear. I mean, like Norman, I'm not trying to treat law as sacrosanct. I'm questioning it, and the rules concerning to the resort to force are very debatable, like law in general, which to date is mostly about allowing the powerful to oppress the weak. The rules on force are a great example, actually, because in general, as the powerful in our society can violate, moral norms and legal rules basically with impunity, while we lock up on a mass basis the weak. Well, who gets in trouble for violating the UN Charter in our world? The weak to date. And the United States would never submit to the new aggression amendments of the International Criminal Court. Putin is getting in trouble, and he's caused a renaissance in concern about aggression, but he's not the strongest actor in the world. And so, this is all really important, but in the end, it seems to me a good starting point for our moral and legal, reasoning to say, let's have a few less illegal wars, including, if we can stop it or punish Putin after the fact, Ukraine, but not just scapegoating him when everyone else, including the United States, gets to perpetrate the same crime over and over. So it's it is, and you're making a great point, but I think that to me right now, going back to concern about the initiation of wars is a better starting point than just concerning ourselves as we have for the last while with how the wars are fought.
With apologies to a few people in the room who raised their hand a little bit late in the process, and to a number of people on Zoom, it is time To end the seminar, for those people here, we're having a wine and cheese reception to congratulate everyone who's published a book internally, but you're here and we'll congratulate you as well. Please join me in thanking Sam Moyn for this provocative and really great book.